You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast, Tech Time. Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast, brought to you by SomersF1.co.uk, making F1 tech easier to understand. Today's episode is called We'll Never Get Through All That. Now, here's your Tech Time host, Matt Two Rumpets.
Hey there, Spanners. How's it going today?
Right, it's okay. I'm glad it's a Tech Time show. I'm able to sit here, relax, and have a rare beer.
Yes, and probably a nap by time all is said and done. Because, of course, this week we are going to take a look at the shiny new Formula One regulations for 2018.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's absolutely fantastic to have you recording and producing this show. So thanks for inviting me along. I'll just sit here, I'll mind my own business and run the live stream for you, Matt.
Yeah, it sounds like a plan. What I love, though, is your unbelievable level of trust that I'm not going to do the same thing that I like to do with the dishes, which is just do such a horrible job of it that you'll never ask me to do it again.
Man, I could list off the amount of jobs I'm not allowed to do this weekend. Added to that is clean the dining room table. I am no longer allowed to clean the dining room table.
How did you score that one?
Man, who knows? Who knows? A cloth wiping, apparently wrong.
Oh, dear. Well, yeah. It's tragic. Absolutely tragic. So we should probably tell the folks that we are an independent podcast hosted by MissedApexPodcast.com. We aim to bring you a race review before Monday's commute. We might be wrong, but we are definitely first. And most importantly, this show is safe for work. We are keeping it clean here so you can play this with the kids in the background or at work.
All right, let's say hello to Summers. He's the one who knows the things.
I know nothing. I don't care what you tell me. Evening, guys. How are you?
We're doing great. It's great to have you on. And what luck that I happened to come home on Thursday, hit up the Twitters, and saw a little tweet from the FIA that said the WMSC had just put forth some new regulations. And really, I swear to God, I only clicked on it just to see the new points table for getting your super license. And then I saw that there were new regulations. Oh, and it's just ruined the rest of my week, I have to say.
Lots of pink writing to take up your time.
Yes, indeed. But I tell you what, before we go and talk about that, what say we cover a little bit of big dirty news?
Big dirty news. Hope those bumpers are coming through okay for you, Matthew, because I'm doing them here at my end and you're recording them at your end. Also, it's worth acknowledging that we are extremely lucky to have Matthew Summerfield on here, who does tech articles for motorsport.com. You continue to slum it with Missed Apex Podcast. Just want to, we don't say it often enough. We are grateful for you coming on and sharing this tech stuff with us.
No, you guys give me a decent platform to work from at the end of the day, and I'm more than happy to give up my time to you guys. It's always fantastic to speak to you both.
Likewise, and let's just go ahead and point right on out that you can also catch him at his very own page too, writing in even greater depth than the motorsport people will oftentimes let him. So I don't know about you, but the thing that really caught my attention this week, and I have to thank the patrons of the show, is that Formula One has put up for vote a classic episode of Malaysia, which they are going to put online once all the votes are in and counted. So they're going to upload a full race from their archives to the actual internets where I believe anyone can watch it. And this is kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
Revolutionary. Come on. Liberty getting on board with what Formula One really needs to do, and that's to include the fan base, get people excited about the sport other than what's actually going on throughout a weekend where we're at the circuit. So yeah, this is a really big step forward, in my opinion, in the direction that Liberty want to take.
And I suggest, gentlemen, that whatever race they eventually choose, we do a race review as if we are there at the time.
I love that idea. Done.
Yeah, spectacular idea.
Yeah. Well, and what was even more interesting is one of our patrons, Utter Shambles, said, this is where they make me want to bang my head into the desk. Not only should they be releasing selective stuff, they should be curating and creating. There are loads of things. Lewis Rise, Rogues Galleries, comparing different era cars, sounds, looks. And I'll tell you what this put me in mind of, and this is sad that I'm the only American on it, the show today, but back in the 80s when I was but a wee lad and still following the NFL closely, they had this production company called NFL Films, and they would recut entire seasons, entire teams, players, all to fantastically motivating music. And I would spend hours and hours watching it just because the cuts were so good. And in a way, the director's cuts that they've been putting out with the unseen footage after the race on the Formula One app very much remind me of the sort of things that NFL Films were doing, only they would do it across whole seasons or across entire players' careers. And I think he's absolutely right. It's a brilliant way to capture new eyeballs, and you can put the stuff up there without even beginning to infringe on the actual broadcasting of the races.
Yeah, and I think it's important that they step into this direction, but I think it's also going to be a slow burn. There's lots and lots of footage out there, and we're not talking about, one camera angle of the event. You can imagine how much information that people have to get through that's historic. So I think there's a lot of data crunching going on at Biggin Hill now that Liberty are in charge of all this footage in order to be able to collate it and give us something that we haven't seen before. And that's one of the things that might be interesting. Will this production that we're going to see of this particular race that is voted upon going to be different to the race that we might have seen at broadcast at that time? And are we going to get commentary from that time, or are we going to get new commentary? I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
Excellent. Well, with that done, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about some of the updates, both the ones you saw in Singapore and the ones we might be expecting in Malaysia?
Yeah, I think the first thing to talk about really is Mercedes, because obviously everybody was expecting Mercedes to really struggle in Singapore, and obviously the first lap incident kind of put pay to the Ferraris and the Red Bull of Max Verstappen, which obviously then pushed the Mercedes into the limelight as such. But what I feel is important to say is that we didn't see the kind of field spread we'd ordinarily see at any other race. And I think that's primarily to do with the fact that Mercedes were quicker than we anticipated them being, but perhaps not as quick as they should be in relativity to the rest of the field. What was your thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, I think ultimately Mercedes had a bit more performance than we expected. Red Bull really, I felt like, were surprising, especially in terms of their Friday pace. It's a shame they don't have a qualifying mode to match, or else it could have been a very, very different race, one that Verstappen might have actually finished. And of course, as far as Ferrari goes, who knows? They didn't even complete the straightaway on the first lap, so it's hard to tell. But what's going to interest me more, I think, is Malaysia, because that would seem to be suiting the Mercedes a bit better if I'm understanding how the different track characteristics are playing into the different wheelbases and chassis characteristics.
Yeah, that's true. It will be Mercedes that will come on stronger in Malaysia. This is the thing that we're really going to see now towards the back end of the season. It's really going to hone in on which car suits which track. And obviously we already talked many times about the different characteristics of the cars, but also we have to bear in mind obviously that the power unit usage, because we've got Mercedes on different lifespan of power unit components compared to Ferrari, who still have a set to introduce. So from a mileage standpoint, we might come across a situation where Ferrari have a little bit more power in hand, let's say, which could come to their advantage in qualifying. And obviously give them a chance when it comes to the race. Right.
So tell me a little bit about Renault. There was a lot of talk about them, and I know that we saw Carlos Sainz saying that he was delighted to see their pace of development. Is their pace of development really all that? And surely he's talking about the car and not the power units, right?
Yeah, because he has one of the Renault power units, so he knows what kind of development rate that they're standing at with that. So yeah, he's talking about things from more or less a chassis point of view, on the basis that he is obviously going to be moving into that team next year. What will be interesting though for me is the difference between who gets and uses the updates, whether it be Hulkenberg or Carlos Sainz, because we have seen this season that Palmer has kind of got the raw end of the deal on more than one occasion. In fact, he's almost a specification behind Hulkenberg whenever there's an update available to them. So when Renault introduced their larger update at Silverstone to sort their problems out, it was a couple of races later that I believe that Palmer actually got those updates, making it difficult to get a grasp of where they actually are against one another in the pecking order. Obviously, it's easy to say that Hulkenberg is the better driver based on the performances that we're seeing, but there is a difference in the specifications of the cars as well.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Hulkenberg is definitely a better qualifier, but we did see Palmer do very well in Singapore, and we certainly saw him do very well last year around this time. And was that due to the same issue he was finally level with in terms of development?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, because you're getting a sort of petering out towards the end of the season. There's less development coming through, so you sort of get to that point whereby each of the drivers are on a static configuration. They've learned as much as they can about the car, not only themselves but the team as well. So they're really at the point whereby if they don't know it now, they're not going to know it at all. It's interesting because a lot of people have mentioned to me about, Renault had this big update with their floor and diffuser and a few other bits and pieces. And yeah, it was a decent package, but what they were pieces that rectified problems that the car already had. So, it wasn't the be end and an end all of a development phase. It was the rectification of problems that perhaps they faced by coming into 2017, and perhaps a little late even. They may have not been in the development loop early enough, and that has made them suffer at the start of the season, and now we're really starting to see that progress. Right.
Well, speaking of progress, tomato or tomato, I guess it doesn't really matter. One of the developments that caught everybody's eye was the Stegosaurus spine on the Force India. What exactly was that about? And is it really as revolutionary as it looks, or was it inevitable someone would think to mess around with that part of the shark fin?
Yeah, and if I can interrupt as well, people were saying it's a monstrosity, it looks ugly, it looks disgusting. No, it doesn't. I mean, people are complaining about the shark fins, the T-wings, everything. These are prototype open-wheel cars. They look odd. Like, if you had never seen a Formula One car before, every Formula One car would look odd. So I think people who are in it for the aesthetics, settle down a little bit. It's a prototype car that's designed to go very, very fast. Given that, I thought the close-ups on that Stegosaurus looked very, very cool. So I want to hear Somers tell me it had an effect, because something that cool needs to be functioning as well.
Yeah, it is a functional element, and it's very much in the same vein as what we see with the T-wings. It's all about, let's go back to front wings. It's what you want to do with the airflow. You want to set up airflow structures that have an impact further downstream. So Force India introduced the airbox winglet with these Stegosaurus spine as well. So the airbox winglet is something we've seen Ferrari and Williams use in the past, and it's all about creating a vortex that helps to make the rear wing work harder. Now, on top of that, these smaller Stegosaurus fins in the maximum allowable area on the engine cover spine, and they really continue to work that airflow hard. So a track like Singapore, where you're really looking for downforce, then it's going to make a major impact. They probably won't use them at every circuit for the rest of the season on that basis, because obviously we don't need maximum downforce everywhere. But for me, it's a very, very important development, and something that's perhaps led on from Mercedes with their cooling chimney. That they have a very similar thing where the spine of their engine cover is opened up and allows the hot air to be extracted from the power unit. So it's a nice area of development, and something that will actually now continue next season, because the shark fins are going to remain.
Yes, and I think that's a good thing. I like the shark fins, and I believe I am not alone in liking the shark fins. Is that you too, Spanners?
I like the shark fins, but can we just like put a picture of the driver's face on either side of the shark fin? That would help greatly.
Yes, big LED panels, right, Summers?
Yeah, well, that's one of the other things you see. Apparently, the reason that they're being allowed to retain the shark fin is that the FIA have basically said, well, yeah, we'll let you have that, but if you do that, we have to have some better identifiers. So we're talking much bigger numbers and the names, etc., on the side of the car. So, yeah, I would, as you say, Matt, really love to see an LED panel, not the monstrosity that we see on the side of the IndyCar, may I add, but something a bit more aesthetically pleasing if we're using it in F1.
Yeah, I'm certainly not borrowing that idea from the WEC. And okay, so finally, we've been waiting. Are we really going to see Ferrari's new engine at Malaysia?
Well, yes, apparently so. And they're obviously on terms of mileage. They really want to introduce this, and I would suspect that they're going to use a new gearbox as well, based on the fact that they didn't finish the last Grand Prix, which should see them out to the end of the season then. So they're going to go into the last few races with a full-blown rear end available to them. And obviously, as we've talked about before, Matt, the most interesting element of this new power unit from Ferrari is supposedly the 3D printed pistons and the way in which that changes the combustion element of the internal combustion engine.
Right. So just to recap what I know, and then you can tell me all the things that I've forgotten. The 3D printed, first of all, it's going to be steel and not aluminum, which should let them run a higher pressure in the chamber. And that the shape of the piston head is going to be able to be printed in a way that it couldn't otherwise be manufactured. And that should also improve combustion within the chamber. That means making the engine more efficient, means less fuel in the cylinder, less fuel burned, less fuel used, a lighter car. Is that sort of kind of it? And what is it about the pressure that makes a difference in terms of the overall power of the engine?
Okay, yeah. So you basically hit the nail on the head. There's lots of things that the design of the piston can affect, and mainly it's to do with combustion. And obviously, Formula One and the hybrid era is linked in as such with the lean burn combustion technology, which obviously deals with direct injection and the way in which the fuel is injected into the cylinder. It's a very high pressure situation, and yeah, the more you can do in terms of the shape of the combustion, the way in which the fuel and air combines and burns, you're going to have big gains, whether that comes in terms of performance or in terms of the way in which the engine lasts, its durability. I think it's a combination of both. Obviously, without the token system in place, this makes things of these development types and cycles so much easier for the teams to make, because there were certain lock-offs in the original regulations. And obviously, without those in place, now Ferrari can go bananas when it comes to this sort of thing. Not only Ferrari, but obviously Mercedes and Renault and Honda as well. But yeah, it's a very interesting element. Unfortunately, it's something we'll probably never see because it's inside the engine. And, Formula One isn't the easiest place to find these kind of things out about.
No, it's not. But it also strikes me that could very well be something that we see coming to road cars near us in the not too distant future, at least the ones that are still running with gas or petrol, as you like to call it.
Yeah, that's it. At the end of the day, all of this technology is transferable. Whether it's Ferrari who uses it as transferable technology is a very debatable situation, but obviously it's a group. Ferrari are not the only ones in that group. So you have your Fiat, Chrysler, etc. And obviously you could see that IP move across to the road car industry down the line. Yeah,
and just to reiterate, that's going to be tremendously important because they all have fleet averages that they have to meet. And that's one of the reasons I think why you see, especially with Dieselgate, a renewed emphasis on electricity, but also on technology like this that can allow them to extract more power with less fuel.
Yeah, it's all about what you would call gas mileage.
Indeed. Hey, Spanners, you want to plug some stuff?
Yeah, I do. I just want to say thank you to the live chat. They're not giving me a hard time at all about my easily distracted nature during Tech Time shows. At least I turn up. At least I'm here. The shows are always more fun with the live chat. So thank you to everyone who comes along. If you want to join them, why not go to YouTube and search for Missed Apex Podcast, click subscribe, and then click the little bell, and that'll tell you every time we go live. Matt, I think that's it for now, apart from to say follow at Missed Apex F1. That's the best place to find out when we're actually going to have a show.
Excellent. Well, let's keep right on moving then. So this week we saw both new sporting regulations and new technical regulations put up by the FIA, approved by the World Motorsport Council, which is the official approving body. And the first thing that caught my eye, I'd like to talk about the sporting regs first. The first thing that caught my eye was, do you all remember an event called F1 Live last year?
Yep.
Happened in London, and it was a big deal, and you will have a bad memory of this, Spanners, because only Lewis Hamilton failed to turn up to it, and he caught a reasonable amount of flack for not having been there.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that this year, under the Regulation 10, track running time outside an event and wind tunnel testing, there is a new exemption carved out, and I quote, B, other demonstration events organized by the commercial rights holder. So to me, that's suggesting that they're going to be doing more of these events, and they want the current Formula One drivers and cars to be able to take place. And one of the other ones that really caught my eye, and this one is going to be, I suspect, a little more talking, is we'd heard a lot of chatter about how going from 4 to 3 engines a year was going to start costing more money. And I know this touches on a bit of your area of expertise, your Spanners. Just simply in terms of reliability, that's a lot of mileage for something as, I know you don't think of an engine as being delicate, but something as delicate as a Formula One engine, that's an awful lot of miles to ask out of it. And that reliability does cost money to engineer, doesn't it?
Well, the thing is as well, it means we can't just have an evolution of this year's engines because we now have to put more of a focus on reliability. It is going to take a lot of man hours and processing. That's what's going to cost the money. People sitting down and figuring out how to make these things more reliable. And presumably, Summers, there's going to have to be some kind of compromise in performance to achieve it.
Well, yeah, exactly. Reliability comes with a cost. Whether it comes in pounds and pennies or whether it comes in terms of performance. And when you're on a knife edge in terms of the championship with Mercedes and Ferrari, for argument's sake, that's really going to play down to the wire, because we'll come towards the middle to the end of the season like we're in the position at the moment, and we'll be looking at the units that each of the drivers have used, and it really could come down to penalties. And I think this is where we're going to have to either say this is a big problem and readdress it before the regulations are set in stone, or the way in which penalties are handed out to drivers is going to have to change, just purely from the fact that it is going to destroy a championship. But that's just my opinion on that one.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what really sticks out to me is that every other year they divide the power unit up into pieces. You got the ICE, you got the MGUH, the MGUK, the turbocharger, the energy store, and the control electronics. And whatever number, you were allowed whatever number of all the parts. But this year, you're only allowed 2 energy stores, 2 control electronics, and remarkably enough, 2 MGUKs. What do you think is behind that, and how does that make any sense? Because we've seen MGUKs go up like candles frequently.
Yeah, well, the reason I think that we've gone down this route is the fact that those are the least problematic areas. They may be problematic for some of the teams or some of the manufacturers, but on the whole, those elements are the least problematic. They're also the most restricted in terms of development. They are weight controlled, and they also have other elements to them that are controlled. So, it's sort of let's take those back a little bit, and hopefully that will rein in the performance element in stake of the reliability that we've just talked about.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what else occurs to me is that they're proposing this as a cost savings measure. And I know we talk about the engineering of it, but it also, matter of factly, if you get hit with a penalty, it's going to cost you championship points. And if it costs you championship points, then it is costing you money, because the money gets paid out at the end of the year based on your standing in the championships. And I just got to ask, just your opinion, like, would we even see McLaren and Honda at such loggerheads if they could just chuck a new engine in and carry on without penalty? Do you not think that a lot of this is having to start from a position where they were never going to be able to make up and be competitive? Spanners.
And just an add-on to that, Korku Noma in the chat room is asking, in this case, what would we propose as the correct amount of engines? And furthermore, somebody is talking about, if only we could just stop them using qualifying engines like we used to do, then we could kind of take the restrictions off completely.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, though, isn't it? At the end of the day, there's always going to be a compromise in some respect. The way that I see it, and I have spoken about this, I don't know if it was on Twitter, but I have spoken about it in the past, is that I believe that the constructors should have a championship, the drivers should have a championship, and we should have a championship for the engine manufacturers. And then that way, there's some way of allowing them to take penalties for the problems that they accrue for the teams that they work with, not only on a works aspect, but also their customers. And it's their customers that I feel sorry for in respect of the way in which that they don't get the full power that the works teams get, and they don't get perhaps the most amount of performance come qualifying or during the race, because they don't have access to all of the information when they're building their cars, etc. So it is a very imbalanced system that we have, and I think that there needs to be an overview look at the way in which that penalties are distributed, whether that's a point system or a financial system in terms of the way in which customers have to pay for their engines if there is problems.
Just a quick shout out to the celebrities in the chat room. We have Bradley Philpott, he of Bradley Philpott Masterclass, agreeing that an engine championship would be fantastic. And we have Chris Stevens, sometime host of Missed Apex, who's a little bit poorly today. Poor Chris Stevens with the sniffles, pointing out that MotoGP have a similar system.
Well, I like it, but really, this all came about, as somebody mentioned, just to prevent having separate qualifying and race engines. And as such, allowing genuine broken parts to be replaced seems like a very simple solution for starters. But I have to admit, I am intrigued by the idea of an engine championship. It might get more people to play. And just as a footnote, there is in the appendix of the sporting regulations specific agreements for new teams and how they can acquire engines. And there's fancy formulas and stuff like that. But if you dig down far enough, at the end of it all, the FIA with the engine manufacturers set a price for a season's supply of engines. Do you know what that number is, Spanners?
Is it really, really high, like 47, or ridiculously low, like 0? All right, I'll admit I wasn't listening.
That's okay. It's actually 12 million euros per season for a supply of engines. And Summers, you want to get in on that?
Do we want to know how much a V8 used to cost?
Yes.
Yes.
As a comparison. And remember that we're talking about pounds here, and we're talking about 2013, so the exchange rates are massively different. But it was £8 million per season for a V8. So we're not demonstrably different for the hybrid power unit. Now, to me, when everybody tells us how expensive these power units are, how are we to cast the two so far apart? That's one of the things that does kind of bug me from time to time.
I wonder if a lot of the ideology, because someone in the chat has just said, look, they need to decide, are they going to go back to pure engines, or I've heard some people say real engines, or are they going to pursue this hybrid? I think people kind of need to get over that a little bit, because the future is incorporating that kind of technology. We are going to ever go away from digging up dead dinosaur and exploding it in a metal box. So I think a lot of it is kind of an ideological objection to moving away from pure internal combustion engines.
Right. I see that Lawrence has asked a very good question. How many engines a season did they use in the V8s? Do you know off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, it wasn't actually restricted, so we didn't have the same restrictions as we have now, but you would probably be talking somewhere between 8 and 10 engines a season. It depends on which part of the V8, because you have to remember that it was in place from 2007 to 2013. So we also had Kerr's introduction in 2009. That increased the cost of the overall package by £3 million. It was around 5 million prior to that. Now I'm quoting Cosworth figures here because Mark Gallagher gave me those figures. They're widely available, but I asked him for them anyway. So yeah, I just think that sometimes you have to have a think about these figures, and are they actually as bad as everybody's making them out to be? Because they don't want them. And who's the one who perpetuates that rumour so much? And he works for Red Bull. That's the only thing I have to say.
Yeah. Spanners, you had something to say?
No, I actually didn't. But while you have me, I can tell people to follow me at SpannersReady and check out an audiobook if they're people who are into audible.com. Go and check out The Beast of Tales End, which is a mystery fantasy detective story voiced by me, SpannersReady. And there will be a sequel. So if you like it, don't worry, there's more to come.
Excellent. Well, now we're going to move on to Spanner's favorite subject, tires. And I just happened to notice that they added some language this year about using tires. And it says, in essence, sets of the same specification may be mixed following the qualifying practice session. Now, is that something that the teams have wanted and they've added, or is that just in case a tire gets damaged? Do you have any background on that?
I'd have to check to be 100% because it is something that's been added into the regulations. But it is my belief it's something that the likes of Force India have been asking for quite some time. Not quite to the degree that they've wanted, because they wanted mixed allocations so that you would be able to run different tyre compounds on each corner of the car if you so wished, which would be extremely interesting and was something that happened in the past. This is more to do with being able to mix sets. So each of the tyres has its own barcode, which is scanned in and out by Pirelli themselves, so that they know that the correct sets are being used by the drivers at any such time. And what it seems to me is that they're going to allow them to be able to run mixed sets, so they can prime them differently during practice, basically, ready for qualifying or the race.
Excellent. And along the way to that, I also noticed, and this is a clarification just for me, about what they're able to do with testing the tires. It says from the time at which competitor receives the tires, they may not be used on any rig, simulator, or vehicle other than F1 car for which they were intended. And is that, were people dragging simulators to the racetrack to put tires on? Or what's that about exactly?
No, I wouldn't expect them to be doing something along those lines. But what we have to remember is that they will do a lot of pit stops during an event as well. I think we're more or less talking here about some static rigs that may be taken to events to try to understand the way in which that the tyre is going to operate. I'm not actually sure that it's an area of problem at the moment, but it's another area that the FIA might, and Pirelli indeed, might want to close down on in case they have seen something happen at a specific event, and just want to stop those infractions occurring in the future.
And I also have to ask, because the following one, which was obviously already in place, is remarkably confusingly worded. They are allowed to use the tires on the car when it's on a rolling road, as long as they're only measuring vertical forces, rolling resistance, and aerodynamic drag. Is that what that regulation states?
I think we're talking about wind tunnel tyres here because of the way in which that the wording is set out. I'd have to sit down and actually study the wording again specifically, but it sounds very much as if we're talking about the way in which wind tunnel tyres are operated. So obviously we have a 60% or a maximum 60% scale model with the tyres being able to be used, but are the teams trying to use them in ways that they shouldn't be used on the wind tunnel model per se? Are they taking them and using them elsewhere outside of the wind tunnel? That might be something that they're trying to cover off with that particular amendment.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, when they use like the rolling roads, like you were talking about the AVL test rigs, what tires do they use on these cars?
Well, that's an area of contention really, because they may not actually be using tyres. They may be using wheel hub motors, but perhaps some of them have transferred them onto their AVL rigs and tried to use them in that way. And this regulation prohibits that, obviously. So, yeah, in my understanding, the AVL rigs are running hub motors, and rather than actually running a physical tyre on a rolling road.
Okay, that's excellent. And that makes it all make a lot more sense. And there's one more thing. Is they've added some wording about jump starts. Specifically, you can either receive a drive-through or a 10-second stop and go for not only moving before the start signal is given, which, seems fairly straightforward, but also positioning your car in such a way that the transponder is unable to detect the moment at which the car first moved from its grid position. Do you have any idea, A, who might be getting away with this, and B, how is that even possible?
Bottas.
Yeah, possibly. Now, this comes down to the position of the transponder in the track and the position of the transponder in the car. Now, there are some arbitrary differences in terms of where you can place the transponder in the car, and obviously where it falls over the transponder in the track is how it picks up the movement when released by the clutch. So if you point your car in a certain direction or you place your transponder in a certain place, etc., you may be able to trick the starting conditions, let's say. It's not going to give you a huge advantage, but it's certainly something that the teams would look at if they think that they can get away with some extra milliseconds of performance.
Yeah, just start rolling the car a little bit at a time. Once the lights go out, just give you that extra advantage, Spanners.
Lorenz in the chat room is saying, I was missing Palmer's transponder the last race, and in fact a few times he's disappeared off the timing sheets, so he could be one of the ones.
Yeah, but that's more to do with the way in which his transponder sends the signal back to the pit lane, I believe. He keeps disappearing off of the leaderboard, doesn't he? Or off of the GPS trace. He's just gone for a cup of tea, I think. Really, he's had enough. I'm off. See you later.
It must just feel personal to him as well. Not only is everyone talking about me leaving Formula One, but even the timing screen's getting a dig in and throwing some shade.
Perhaps there's an engineer just running up and down the pit lane with his transponder, pretending he's going around, when in fact he's just sat in the back of the garage.
Yeah, well, that is the saddest thing, because he's got to be like, I finished sixth, and then he looks up the timing screen and he's not even on it. Just harsh. Okay, well, do you want to tell us a little bit about where to catch up with you there, Somers, before we move on?
Yeah, so obviously you can catch my stuff with Giorgio Piola over on motorsport.com. After each race, we do several technical articles looking at all the best developments that have gone on during the last race. So there's usually 4 or 5 of Giorgio's best illustrations there. We often put together some 2D animations, and that's all my work involved in that. And then we have Giorgio's 3D animations, which are works of art, just like his illustrations.
Better, yeah.
And then obviously you could catch me over on the blog, which is SomersF1.co.uk.
Brilliant. So before we move on to the technical regulations, let's talk a little aerodynamics, because I did notice this change in the wind tunnel testing, that they're very concerned about the rate of change of the wind that they're blowing over the car And they don't want it to be the change to be less than 4.5 meters, or not less than. Basically, they can only accelerate and decelerate the wind at a fairly sedate pace. And I'm wondering what would cause them to suddenly lock that out, and what advantage a team might gain from having very sudden changes of velocity when they're looking at it in a wind tunnel.
Okay, I think there might be two things going on here. Firstly, it's to do with the amount of wind tunnel time that the teams now have available to them. So we could be talking about teams taking advantage of being able to get more on time, on wind, as they call it, time out of the wind tunnel. So they're ramping down the meters per second in order to make changes to the model itself and be able to continue the run, just maximising the amount of time that they have in the tunnel on different specifications. And I suppose the other option is the fact that they are trying to cheat the 60 metres per second upper limit that is available to the teams. Is it 60? It might be 50 metres per second. I forget off the top of my head. But there's an upper limit as to what can actually be run in the tunnel in order to get their findings.
Yeah, no, the actual wording is acceleration or deceleration must be less than 4.5 meters per second squared, and the phases are between 15 meters a second and 95% of the maximum wind tunnel airspeed. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they're mentioning a frequency of 2 hertz as well. So, yeah, there's again, it's something that I'll have to look at in more depth, but it's an interesting element where they're trying to close down perhaps something that they've seen in data that's appearing on multiple wind tunnel runs, which is, it just gives away a clue that something is not as it should be, let's say. So they're just trying to narrow down the window of opportunity for the teams to make those gains.
Excellent. Well, I tell you what, before we talk about the tech regs, how about we let Spanners plug some more stuff?
Well, that sounds absolutely fantastic. Why don't you join this live stream, 8 p.m. on Sundays? But occasionally we are lucky enough to catch up with Joe Saywood. He of GP Plus magazine has been to every Grand Prix since 1998. And we are very, very lucky to have him in the shed talking to me tomorrow night, which is Monday at 8 p.m. And you can catch that obviously on the Missed Apex podcast feed. So just search for Missed Apex podcast on your podcatcher of choice. Also, why not, if you haven't already, look back and listen to our interview with Jack Nicholls. He was very honest, very open, very fun. It was a lovely interview. You can also watch that on the YouTube channel as well. So make sure you don't miss out. And if you haven't caught up with that, that probably means you haven't caught up with Bradley Philpott's Car Racing Masterclass. And even if you don't intend to do a track day in the near future, I'm almost tempted to say don't listen to it while you're driving on the road because it gives you very, very funny ideas about how you should approach certain junctions. But it's amazing. A lot of the individual things are obvious and they're things but the way it's put together gives you kind of a real insight into what these racing drivers are faced with when you're watching the race. It's amazing how many people watch Formula One and don't think about what it's actually like to control the car. So check out Bradley, check out Joe, check out Jack.
Right. So if life is like a box of chocolates, then to me, FI regulation changes are a bit like a game of Clue, or what do you call it? Cluedo over there? Whatever. For example, when it comes to oil burning, it's not Colonel Mustard in the library with a candelabra, but it's Ferrari in Baku with a secondary oil tank. And so with that in mind, let's talk about oil tanks. Boy, did they add a lot of stuff about oil tanks in these regulations.
Yeah, and to be honest, I would suggest it's all to do with covering off technical directives. We started to mention this pre-show, Matt, and it's basically that certain areas of the regulations were left a little open to interpretation, and lots of technical directives have passed backwards and forwards in the last couple of seasons to rein in oil burning, but now we're finding that to actually make it a legal standpoint, we're having to introduce those elements into the regulations, because as we know, a technical directive is only the opinion of Charlie Whiting and the stewards, and isn't actually 100% enforceable.
Yes, we could ask Ross Braun about that now that he's in charge, couldn't we?
We sure could.
Right. Well, it did interest me that they mentioned no active valving between the oil tank and the engine. I always lose active control valves between any part of the power unit and the engine intake air is forbidden. Is that something that you think was actually going on, or is this just, again, their forestalling possibilities?
No, it was something that was definitely going on. And it's all to do with the fact that oil must be sent into the combustion or the intake as part of the hybrid regulations. It's always been there. Now, teams have been using active valves in order to control the amount of oil that is sent into the combustion chamber to be burnt, or oil vapor in most respects. And this is where part of the problem has come about, because not only are they able to burn the amount of oil that there have been, it's been controllable. So under certain transient conditions, you might want to add a little bit more oil burning to receive a bit more performance. And so what they're trying to do is take away some of the toys, let's say, that the engine manufacturers and the constructors have had access to throughout the hybrid era.
Right. And that would be because ultimately burning oil in the combustion chamber is not good for the length of life of the power unit.
It's predominantly to do with performance and reining in performance. What they're essentially doing is cheating the fuel flow restriction, because you're adding a combustible element to the performance of the power unit. So yeah, what they're trying to do is just rein in the amount of oil that can be burnt.
Yeah, for those of you who are just listening and not watching, go find Spanners and his tweets. He's just held up his new, what is that, your new standard, your new family herald there?
Right, I didn't think you guys would be so easily distracted. It is, in fact, a hand drawing of me riding a giant honey badger into battle with an MP5 and some kind of futuristic lance. I apologise for the interruption. I'll just drift back into the background again.
At least he's not sleeping, Matt.
Yeah, no, I'm impressed. I mean, here we are headed towards 45 minutes, and he has yet to fall asleep entirely, except for that bit where we talked about him. But he'll find out soon enough. And now I think on to probably one of the most disappointing regulations: minimum weight. Minimum weight up to 733 kilograms unfueled, which means we're going for 838 with 105 kilos of fuel on board. That just seems a bit, I don't know, can I use the word porky without offending anybody for a Formula One car?
It's extremely heavy, isn't it? It's not something that is desirable, and it's all part of the hybrid regulations, unfortunately. The extra 5 kilograms that we're getting added are from a safety aspect, though, this time. So I do kind of have empathy in terms of being able to deal with an extra 5 kilograms. That 5 kilograms is being put into the regulations to allow for the halo and the increase in wheel tethers. So I do have some sympathy this time around. But yeah, heavy set cars is not the way to go, because it just means that we have to have more power and downforce in order to achieve the same net results.
Yeah, and that means the engines have to run higher and last less long, and a whole host of problems. But they don't handle the same way once they hit a certain weight, would be what I would say. And you can see it when you go back and look at old races. You just really can't chuck the cars around. There's too much mass behind them for them to change direction the same way.
Yeah, we basically added 100 kilograms to the cars now. I think it's just shy of that. We're about 93 kilograms from memory. That's like adding another person to the car. An average person weighs about 85 kilos. So, yeah, there we go. Another person sat on the airbox, effectively.
Wow. All right. So they also mentioned in the technical regulations 5.1 inserts. Now, I would presume that inserts are a pretty normal thing for any engine. And why exactly do we need a regulation about it, and what exactly are they trying to prevent?
Okay, so the total volume is inserts within the component cannot be more than 10% of the total volume of the component. Now, that to me gives away some of what's going on here. In other words, what is being classed as an insert is used for a secondary function. So whether that's down to weight, etc. It's all about reining in the placement of weight and the usage of the area of the car. Basically, they're trying to stop the teams from creating something that just isn't necessary.
Okay, all right. Well, speaking of necessary, I hear an engine plenum is a fairly necessary thing, but why would they be concerned about the air temperature going into it? And specifically, they are saying it has to be 10 degrees centigrade above ambient temperature. And they're gonna use an average recorded temperature, and they're gonna tell the teams, and they're gonna use a sensor to make sure that they're not cheating. So, how would you control that, and how will it make a difference to the teams?
Okay, so this might be down to the work in which that the air has gone through before it reaches the plenum. If you imagine putting energy into the airflow by disturbing it with the car, you are effectively increasing its temperature because you are putting more energy into that airflow. So I think this is to do with that in that respect. Now, whether this is because the teams have figured that they can gain from increasing the energy and increasing the temperature going into the plenum is open to debate. But it is down to performance. There's no two ways about the reason why this is being put into the regulations. This is a performance element.
Yeah, well, it actually says more than, so it must be more than 10 degrees above ambient temperature. So I know from turbochargers, cold air is usually better because it has more density. So it sounds like somebody's been giving extra cooling to that air, but again, I'm at a loss as to why they would want to prevent that, because it seems like it would just make the engines run better.
Yeah, but it's all down to then, if one team has a massive advantage because they have figured out how to run in this particular configuration, let's say, then it's about the FIA trying to find a way in which to level that playing field. And that might seem unfair in some ways, but we want to see a competition, and this perhaps might bring that or rein that in to allow them to run closer together.
So it's sort of like balance of power without actual balance of power.
Yeah, but basically like a turbo restrictor without a turbo restrictor. I used to run one on my supercharger, and I'd take it off if I wanted a little bit more power.
Brilliant. I love it. Okay, so let's talk about power units a little bit. They added a whole bunch of new language about the size of the power unit elements. And first of all, they're requiring them to all be installed wholly within the survival cell, which either they didn't specify that in years past, or they've decided they want it that way to make sure that nobody decides to play fast and loose with it. But they're also saying, and this is what I'm looking at, the weight must be greater than the minimum weight of the same elements between all the power units at the start of the 2017 season, and the same is true for the volume. It must be greater than the 2017. Why would they do that? So it seems like they're restricting the area you can put the power unit in, and they're telling you it has to be heavier potentially and take up more volume than it previously did.
Yeah, it's all to do with, again, control and trying to create some parity. Obviously, it's to do with the way in which things are packaged. There's a vast difference between the way in which each and every one of the teams package their cars. So they're trying to create sort of a shadow in which that everything would have to lie. We've talked about this in the past. Architecturally, the cars are very different. Different teams will run them in different ways. So all of the Merc-powered cars, aside from Mercedes, so we have Mercedes who run a liquid-to-air intercooler, and we have Force India and Williams who both run a side pod air-to-air intercooler, and that changes the way in which the power unit can be run parameter-wise. So it gives Mercedes a distinct advantage over their customer teams. So that could be part and parcel of what the FIA are trying to do here. Obviously, they're also stipulating weight, which is quite an interesting thing. So we're basically saying that we can't go lower. There's no way of reducing the amount of weight on the power unit. So you can't suddenly use some exotic materials to transfer the weight out of the power unit and make gains elsewhere.
Right. And that's going to limit the amount of ballast that, say, a team that had figured out a trick will be able to run for next year. So again, it's all, so you're saying a lot of these are kind of about balancing out performance, where the FIA feel one team has gained a distinct advantage.
Yeah, that primarily, and basically, to try and level the playing field a little bit, a bit of parity amongst the works teams and the customer teams as well.
All right. Well, I tell you what, I would like to combine our next two subjects, which is the halo, in that we finally have actual halo regulations, and wheel tethers. And the interesting thing to me about the wheel tethers is we knew that they were going to get redesigned after the whole Toro Rosso fiasco, because it turned out that you were allowed to just sort of knot individual strands of a tether back together, and then that would be considered okay. And whether or not it was structurally or functionally okay, it sure didn't look good on television. So that's been changed, and the requirements specifically were that the tethers, only two elements of a tether can run through a single suspension element, and they're not allowed to share fittings in a way that they previously were.
Yeah, and again, obviously, this has an impact on weight and the placement of weight, because we're putting tethers and their anchoring points in positions that they haven't been in before. So yeah, we're changing the dynamics. Let's say it's not going to have a major impact, but it also has an impact on the overall weight and what we were talking about with the increase of that extra 5 kilograms on the whole minimum weight aspect.
Right. And now on to the thing that really blew my mind when I read it, is that the Halo, which has been sold to us as a driver head protection device, and the only actual testing of the Halo we've ever seen is wheels being shot out of an air cannon, is now officially classified as a roll structure. And there were always two roll structures in the regulations. So maybe this is just the FIA being lazy. But they specifically say that they are designed to help prevent injury to the driver in the event of the car becoming inverted. And now, to add to that, from our wheel tethers, it says each team must supply detailed geometries which clearly show that any two of the three tethers will independently prevent a wheel from making contact with the driver's head during an accident. So I'm just going to ask here, is this a case where you think that maybe in further testing they feel like there's a potential problem or area where a wheel could still contact a driver's head? Or is this just for the banishing of all doubt? And they're just being lazy about the language and using stuff that was primarily already in the regulations rather than properly rewriting them to reflect what I think myself and most other people who've looked at the Halo felt that its primary purpose was to be, which is basically to keep things like tires from hitting drivers in their heads.
And I think as well, like what do you call it in America, Matt? Optics. The optics are now confused on why they're doing this. I think people have had an idea in their head of the motivation of pushing through with this extra head protection. And now with this regulation, it's almost like they're just piling on more things to justify the initial cause rather than having these problems in the regs that they're then addressing with the Halo. It's just a very, very mixed message.
Yeah, okay. So, there's several things here. It is a mixed message. We consider the primary roll structure to be the hoop behind the driver's head, yes. The secondary roll structure is the one that is in front of the cockpit, and that is what has always been in front of the cockpit. So the way in which this has been worded, for me, as you say, Matt, is primarily because the FIA haven't had time to rewrite the regulations in its entirety. And we've seen this done on many occasions. You know, there's 4 drafts of the 2017 regulations and very little change between them. But it's all to do with the way in which we interpret the regulations. So yeah, the halo, obviously secondary role structure, that means that it is something that is going to be a primary structure when involved in an inversion, as you mentioned. But as you say, we've been sold it as something that is going to impede debris, and they're not making that assertion with the way in which these regulations are written. And for me, that is a little disturbing in some respects, but also it's because of the way that the regulations have been written and just amended. This is the problem that you find with the technical regulations. How many pages are we on now? Is it 104? 104.
104,
I have a set of 1988 regulations which are 4 pages long, and they are in both French and English. So it's like as Bernie Ecclestone once said about the way in which his terms to F1 were written. It's a Victorian house that needs pulling down and rewriting, because they've got so bloated that there is a lot of erroneous text in there.
Well, it's political correctness gone mad, as some people say. On the Gas in the chat room says, don't worry, Somers will set us straight on the wording of the secondary role structure.
I think I just did, but yeah, it's because it's taking over from something else. The halo is taking the position of the frontal structure that was in place before. So as Matt says, it's a bit of, I'm not going to call it laziness, but it's just that the wording of the regulations has been added to, and it needs to be revised totally in order to take into account the actual halo itself, rather than just being a secondary structure. And as regards to the tethers and the way in which that they're being dealt with, I think they're in response to what's actually happening with the halo. Because at the end of the day, yes, the halo has had a ballistic tyre thrown at it from a cannon, but it's going to be impacted by tyres in the event of a collision, and it has to be able to withstand those kind of scenarios. So I think the increase of tethers and the wording that goes on with them, the way that they're anchored, etc., is a lot to do with the introduction of the halo. It's not so much an isolated incident, and not all to do with what happened with Toro Rosso, in my opinion, at least.
Okay, then. So keeping the tire from hitting the driver's head is not related at all to the halo and how it actually functions, because of course we don't have any of the actual testing available to us.
No, and this has been the biggest problem with the halo, hasn't it? Is people's opinion of what it should actually do. And this is why we had the various other tests like the aero screen and the other sort of canopy style solutions, because as soon as you mention head protection, everybody's immediate thought is the smaller debris. And as we've already talked about on past shows, these are all things that happen once in a blue moon. And it's trying to find a solution that covers a lot of these problems. And yes, the canopy does that, but it also causes other issues in the whole design of the F1 car. And I think, I've mentioned this in the past as well. Yes, we really want the drivers to be safe and have head protection, but were we better to think about 2021 when the whole of the car design is up for renewal? Could we not have come up with a better solution that fits the criteria with a complete redesign of the cockpit, rather than us having to make adjustments like the tethers and the Xylon panels inside the cockpit in order to account for the changes that have come because of the halo?
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to say, you mentioned the word Xylon, but before we wrap up with you telling us exactly what that is, because frankly, it sounds like a space alien from a sci-fi show to me. Real quick, last thing to ask about, holes in the cockpit. They are now specifically saying the holes need to be for the sole purpose of routing wiring looms, cables, fluid lines, and they prescribe a maximum dimension for them. Has anyone been up to anything naughty with these holes, or is it just my fevered imagination?
Again, I think it's a clarification of something that's come up in technical directives in terms of the way in which that driver cooling is applied and the way in which the air is routed around the car and through the car. So we've got things like the S ducts that have been pushed to their limits, let's say, over the last few years, and the way that they're interpreted for use. So yeah, this is just really, for me, a bit of a cleaning up of the wording within the regulations to prohibit teams from actually doing something that they shouldn't be.
Excellent. All right, Spanners, what do you think Xylon is?
I think it's a place you go in the aftertime if you've been really good and read all the right books.
Excellent. So tell us what it is for real, Somers, as we wrap up the show.
Okay. Well, it's kind of a bit of it's protection, basically. It's a very much like, most people will understand what I mean when I say Kevlar. For bulletproof protection. Xylon is very much the same, only is much thicker and able to sustain a much bigger incursion. It has a higher tensile strength. That was the word I was looking for. It's 1.6 times that of Kevlar, as I refer to the notes that I made earlier today. And yeah, it's been in F1 for a number of years. I think the most obvious thing is the tethers. They are made of Xylon in order to improve their strength and rigidity and stop the wheels from coming off, let's say. But in most recent years, the thing that most people will be aware of is the introduction of the Xylon strip on the visor of the helmet after Massa's incident. Now, Massa fortunately had a Xylon strip above his visor when he had his incident, and it was proactively because of that design that it's now a mandatory feature of the design.
Excellent. And just to be clear, in the regulations, it's now required that the sides of the survival cell be lined with Xylon, which is why I asked the question in the first place.
Well, they've actually been lining it already, 7 plies in previous years, but with the introduction of the other secondary roll structure, we've now gone up to 16 plies. So it's an increase from 7 to 16 plies, which obviously is all to do with side incursion. And this is all to do with the fact that we've added structures to the car and trying to change the way in which that deformation happens if there were to be a large accident.
All right, Spanners, I think it is time.
Hey, buddy, how can I help?
I think we're done.
All right. Well, do you want to give an award of a thing?
Well, have you been keeping track of the comments?
Of course I have. How dare you? I, of course, have something ready for
Comment of the Week.
Christopher in the chat room came in early in the pre-shoot show by saying cleaning the dining room table has to be a euphemism. Obviously, that was pre-show, and I edit all of that out of the final YouTube video. Josh Covey suggests that alcohol is a solution. Christopher comes in again and says, teams that use too many engines should be fined and added that money to the prize money of those who don't. And that will incentivize reliability. And there was a couple of Palmer comments that I'm struggling to find. Have you been in there deleting things, Matt?
No, absolutely not.
Ah, there it is. No one looks at Palmer. If this happens, he ceases to exist. And that's what happens with his transponder. And Lauren says, I believe that the timing system simply couldn't believe that he was overtaking Bottas. Sam Watley suggests that Xylon is the non-iron paradise.
Brilliant. And you have a winner.
Yes, it is Christopher that says Xylon is the name for what we call Earth in the multiverse where Honda are fast and reliable.
Comment of the Week.
I have to say, Matt, you make that look easy. It's actually quite hard.
Yeah, it kind of is, isn't it? And they go by at an alarming rate when you're trying to keep track of them for a purpose.
And you pay attention during the shows. So imagine what it's like for me. Yeah, so join me tomorrow night. I'm going to be speaking to Joe Saywood. And, of course, on Sunday, we're going to be reviewing the Malaysian Grand Prix, which is the home of Mercedes. This is one, I think, that they can't afford to mess up. And I don't think they will. And it's just going to be really, really exciting. I know everyone is saying that Lewis Hamilton now has this wrapped up. But didn't we think that last season before his engine went pop in Malaysia. So I think that we all have still a very exciting season to look forward to. So just remember that until next time, wounds heal, chicks dig scars, and glory lasts forever. This was Tech Time. I have to say, Matt, it was very unfair asking me a load of questions on the one show where I'm just playing with the live stream and talking to the chat room, asking me what Xylon is in the middle of it.
I was just giving you a chance to be your usual witty self.
Yeah, well, I have to be awake and paying attention for that. Doesn't just happen.
What can I say? It just seemed appropriate to ask you for a silly definition before we went to Summers.
Absolutely. And can I say congratulations to you for A, being only a couple of minutes late, so well done, and B, keeping the show to under 2 hours on a Tech Time. So, I think you've had a blinder, mate, to be honest.
Yeah, I was like, oh, it's so close. But I had the whole schedule mapped out in my head before we started.
Did you actually get all that content in?
Yeah, all of it.
Wow.
Actually, no, I didn't ask him about the missing appendices. That would be the only thing I didn't ask about.
Post-show waffle.
Post-show waffle.
Well, the thing is, for me, these are very much like when I talk to Bradley Philpott, in that I didn't understand any of it in real time. So I just know that I'm going to listen to it afterwards and enjoy it. But I just look out for key markers where I might have to say something. That's the kind of the trick. But on this one, Matt caught me completely on the hop every single time. Where with, you just pick up on Bradley's last word, understeer. Speaking of understeer, because I've handily put that in the next bit of my notes. But it's good. I can't wait to listen back to it.
I also know the reason why you can't concentrate on Tech Time. It's because when you listen back, you're pretending to be me and you're talking in your voice of me.
No. Hang on. No, I'm talking. My voice of you is your voice. So you get the roll cage infrastructure, and then you're like on the road. No. This is one for bedtime. Yeah, listen to it at bedtime. I think we should do yours in. You'll break your Tech Times up into 57 individual podcast chunks. So when I fall asleep, it only goes a certain way, and I have to click the next one.
There should be a buzzer after every segment.
Just to wake me up. Okay, I'm there. No, they are good. It's an attention span.